Hello and welcome to Conscious TV. I'm Iain McNay and today my guest is Hardin Tibbs. Hi Hardin.
Hello.
And at Conscious TV we're always scouring new books and magazines and articles and things, and I found this article in a magazine a few months ago called Dreams of an Eco-Spiritual Futurist. I thought that sounds interesting and I read the article and it was an interview with Hardin. So we've now got Hardin along to Conscious TV and we're going to find out what the dreams of an eco-spiritual futurist are. So let's just start in general terms, what you see as an eco-spiritual futurist.
Okay, well, I can't say that much about the dreams bit. That was the title put in by the magazine. But the eco-spiritual futurist bit, I coined that because it seemed to capture the main themes in my work. So there's an environmental strand. That's something I've been working on since the late 80s, thinking about the way technology needs to be adapted to better fit the environment. There's the future aspect, and that's I've been working as a professional futures researcher in working as a consultant for industry and government since the early 90s. So that's a major theme in my professional work, but then I've applied that also to the question, the more, if you like, esoteric questions about where the planet is going in terms of conscious evolution and this kind of thing. And that brings in the spiritual bit. And also, of course, my own personal sort of journey in that realm, quite apart from the professional bit. So this eco-spiritual futurist, I was slightly tongue-in-cheek, but it was a way of capturing those three themes and expressing how they interact.
Yeah, we were talking on the phone a few days ago about how you first got interested in things, let's say, beyond the normal. And apparently it was when you had a holiday many years ago in Wales and you discovered Dowsing. That opened up a door for you, didn't it?
Yes, that was many years ago. That was sometime in the mid-1970s. And I was on a holiday in North Wales, and somebody showed me how to dowse, the forked twig thing, and you can find underground water that you can't see. And I had a very skeptical scientific sort of turn of mind at that point, that stage in my life, and I knew that this was something that shouldn't be happening. Scientifically, I shouldn't be able to do this, and yet there I was doing it. I was experiencing it. It wasn't theory. I was actually there doing it. And I thought, well, this made me think, you see, that if that isn't supposed to be true and yet it is true, what else, is there that isn't supposed to be true that might be true? Maybe God exists after all and this kind of thing. So that set me off on a kind of journey of discovery.
So people that don't know what dowsing is, it's basically you have a piece of wood and you're able to find out if there's water somewhere underneath the earth.
Yeah, this is obviously a technique that dates from maybe thousands of years ago, and that was used in the past in sort of pre-industrial, pre-scientific means of finding water when people wanted wells. And there were usually people in a community who had this knack of holding. You get a sort of forked twig, which is supposed to be from a hazel tree or something, I think, and you hold it in a certain way, and you walk slowly forward. And when you're over an area where there's water underground, the stick just dips.
Yeah.
And
you dig away and there's the water.
You dig and you hope you find the water.
Yeah. It's amazing, isn't it, how we take so many things for granted in the world, and there is a lot of ancient wisdom and customs that actually do throw us in terms of our conventional thinking, and that's exactly what happened to you. And what did that lead you on to in terms of reading and investigations?
Well, then I wanted to know, partly there was a scientific interest, what's going on here, how could this be possible? And partly, it was then looking at things that I'd been taught, if you like, weren't true, like God doesn't exist and this kind of thing. People can't possibly know each other's thoughts, all of the sorts of received wisdoms of high modernity, sort of materialistic way of thinking. And I started looking for any clues I could find as to, maybe an alternative view on these things. And so I used to go down to Watkins bookstore, books shop in the West End.
Which is still there.
Which is still there, yes. But in those days, of course, before the internet and all these things, there were only a few kind of outlets where you could find strange material like that. And I read an enormous number of books and gradually educated myself in all sorts of esoteric areas.
And where were you being pulled in terms of which kind of areas and interests were particularly attracting you?
Well, one of the things I discovered fairly early on was the idea of meditation. That you could actually, in some way, kind of evolve or develop your own conscious awareness and reach higher states of awareness by meditating or some kind of spiritual practice. And at some point, I discovered Buddhism and read about Buddhism, which I really wasn't aware of up to that point. And remember, this was still, the mid-1970s. And so there was some interest in these things, but certainly nothing like the level of interest that there is today. And I discovered that there was a Buddhist monk from Sri Lanka who was living somewhere in London. A follower of his had bought a house for him and sort of invited him to come and live in London. So he was living somewhere in North London, giving teaching and so on. And I studied under him for, I think, 2 or 3 years. But what I felt was that there was no guarantee. You could meditate, you could sit and meditate, and that was quite interesting. But there was no guarantee that you would achieve enlightenment. In fact, the monk said so. He said, you shouldn't think that just because maybe you sit and meditate in the forest for 50 years, but there's no guarantee you're going to achieve enlightenment. So I thought, well, that's not entirely satisfactory. I was looking for something that would, deliver on this idea of enlightenment rather sooner than that. So I kept looking.
Did you feel yourself change personally when you were meditating?
I felt that, I can't say, I'm thinking back a long time
yes,
now.
I understand.
I think mainly I became aware that there were different mental states that you could access. And at the same time as I was doing this, or after some period of time of doing this, I also was taking lessons with somebody who developed a thing called the mind mirror. And again, this was very advanced technology for the period. There was a box about so big with rows of LEDs, and one side was for one side of the brain and the other for the other side of the brain. And you had a band put around your head with electrodes, and you could immediately see the frequencies that your brain was producing. Huh. And it made a pattern on the thing, because normally you have to wait for the printout from the paper printout from the EEG machine to see what's going on. But this showed you it straight away. So as soon as you began any kind of meditative practice, you could see, or somebody watching, if you had your eyes shut, they could see immediately the changes that were going on in your brain. And all sorts of things were discovered by this chap. For example, he discovered that when anybody who was a good faith healer was actually healing someone, if both people were wired up and they both were on a mind mirror, that what happened was that the person being healed, their brain rhythms became the same as the healers,
really,
with about 1/3 of a second delay. So that was a really very interesting effect. There was this sort of scientific side to my interest going alongside this sort of experiential, meditation and so on. And I had several sessions where I went into quite deep meditation, and it was recorded. There was a tape recording made of the picture on the mind mirror, and my skin resistance and these kinds of measures. So it was very interesting stuff.
And I think you spent some time actually in a Buddhist monastery.
No, all of this was done without going to India or anywhere else. This was all actually...
Okay, I just wrote down that you went to a Buddhist monastery for a time, but maybe I misunderstood you.
No. Well, no, in the sense that this monk was living in London. I suppose it was like a sort of, North London monastery, you might say, but not literally.
And then I think you got interested in Gurdjieff via the works of Bennett. Is that right?
Yes. Well, I was continuing to read, of course, through all this period. And reading about things like Kahuna, the Hawaiian magical system, and so on. And at some point, I came across John Bennett's writing, and he was an extremely interesting man who was a very powerful intellect, but very interested in all these esoteric matters. And he'd written at one point, I think it must have been in the 1950s, a massive 3-volume set of books, sort of size of a small encyclopedia called The Dramatic Universe, which is a kind of esoteric, a sort of survey of esoteric science, or the esoteric viewpoint seen from a scientific perspective. And it's quite interesting material. I don't think anybody still has come close to anything like that. But he'd also written his autobiography up to that period in the 1970s, which was very interesting because he was the head of British intelligence in the Middle East and various things, and knew many different languages, and himself had gone on a kind of spiritual quest and had visited many of the sort of hidden monasteries in parts of the Middle East. And at some point he'd come across Gurdjieff, and he'd started doing the Gurdjieff teaching, and he was in a sense Gurdjieff's representative in England. And so I read all this with great interest. But he also, in this story, he told about how after he'd been in the Gurdjieff movement for some while, word came from Indonesia that there was a spiritual teacher in Indonesia who had some kind of a spiritual transmission, that he could actually just give to people, and they would immediately, some strange spontaneous way, they would immediately receive a spiritual contact. So I read this in the book. I thought that sounds really interesting, But of course, nothing like that ever happens to me, But that's how fascinating. But in fact, I had read about this in a book a little earlier, but somehow the earlier description didn't quite fire my interest. But reading this version Bennett had written, it just really got me very interested. So I started looking for this thing is called Subud, S-U-B-U-D,
which I'd never heard of before.
Yes, it's strange because often it doesn't appear in these lists of spiritual movements and so on. I don't know. Of course, now you can find everything on the internet. So as long as you know it's there, you put it in.
I did a Google search,
and
I saw there's these centres in the UK.
Yeah. No, it's all over the world. But I suppose for just small numbers of people. But anyway, they well, as I say, I started looking for this and had some difficulty. I took myself along to Watkins' bookshop again, my sort of source of information for these things, and said, had they heard of Subud? They said, yes, we've heard of Subud, and pointed to a book they had on the shelf and said, well, do you know if it still exists? Is it still can I find it? He said, no, we think it may have died out. Remember, this is the 1970s, and the thing had come to the West in the 1950s. But I did keep looking, and eventually, I had cut a long story short, I found it, and I also received this spiritual contact, and I've just kept doing that ever since.
And it's a kind of a process which they call testing, I think, where you receive guidance.
Well, there is that, but in a sense, that's a sort of secondary aspect of the thing, because the primary aspect is this sort of direct spiritual contact. And for me, I suppose that was exactly what I was looking for. I was looking for something that went beyond all the descriptions. It's a bit like that old Zen thing about the finger pointing at the moon. Well, a lot of the descriptions you read, if you read a book about something spiritual, essentially you're closely looking at the finger. You're not actually experiencing the moon. So there's a description of something, but you're not directly experiencing it. And of course, meditation, to some extent, overcomes that. But I just found that this was going way beyond anything that I'd experienced in meditation. You could say I didn't meditate for long enough, I don't know, but it was what I was looking for. It sort of made sense of everything.
And can you give me like a practical example of what the direct spiritual contact is?
Well, I suppose because it you asked me earlier, did I experience any change as a result of meditating? Well, I certainly experienced changes as a result of this Subud contact. There's no doubt about that. But it's hard to, I can describe it, but obviously you'd have to experience it to verify, what I'm saying. But I suppose I would say my understanding of what it is that the spiritual is, because the spiritual is pretty woolly in terms of definition, what people mean by the spiritual. But it's, how can I say, a realm or something which is beyond what we see in ordinary life, as it were, the sort of the visible world. There is something beyond, and that something beyond seems to have just as much structure as the world around us does when we look at it scientifically. And that this contact is some kind of an initiative, or an energy or an initiative from that other realm, which has the action, among other things, of sort of waking up your soul. It's as if, now, I remember at school I was taught that the idea of the soul was some medieval nonsense. It was completely discredited scientifically. Science had proved there was no such thing as a soul. There was just the brain, and consciousness and everything was a side effect of neurons in the brain. And I bought into that view at that earlier stage. But what Subud made me realize was that, yes, there is something else. I remember the evening, I received this contact, and it really hit me very hard. And I realized at the end of this sort of half an hour of receiving this flow, that I'd always identified myself, my identity, with my intellect. That was me. And that I just knew for sure, as a result of just that half an hour, that I was my true intellect was something else. And if I had to say where it was, I'd say it was here. It wasn't here.
Okay.
There was something here, and that this something here doesn't die. Now, I can't prove to you, I'm just describing what I experienced, and what was absolutely convincing to me was that there's this other aspect of me. Something had changed inside me. Something had been kind of nudged awake, and I could feel the difference.
So there was like an internal aspect of what you truly were. Would that be right,
yes,
roughly?
I suppose, we put all sorts of labels on things, and there are all kinds of labels in this whole area of the spiritual, the inner self, and all these kind of things. So I'm trying to just describe as directly as I can. But so something inside me, which was different from our ordinary consciousness, was shaken awake by this process. And then, obviously, because it's not just the one instance, it's something I've been doing for years and years since then, and what it involves is basically going twice a week to the local sort of meeting place where the people who are in this thing meet twice a week, and just receiving this flow. You could say it sort of resembles a kind of flow meditation, if you like, but it's this impulse from beyond. You're not concentrating in any particular way. You're just allowing this flow to occur, and you can stop it at any moment. You're just allowing it to occur, and as that happens, it gradually. It's a kind of teaching, It's as if the analogy I used to give people when they were trying, because when I first came into this, everybody was asking me, "What on earth is this thing you're doing?" And I was trying to find ways of explaining it, and I said, "Well, it's as if, there's a library somewhere, and this library contains all the knowledge about the universe and everything you might want to know, and we tell each other, we speculate about whether this library exists." But what's happened to me is that I've found the door, and I've opened the door, and I've walked in, and I've looked around, and I can see that the library is there, and I can see all these shelves going up, a bit like a Borges story, All these books are there, but I now know that's true, but it's obviously going to take me quite some time to read all the books.
Right.
So that was the analogy.
Right. No, that's fascinating. I think that's an important part of the picture of we get to know you better and what you're actually doing. And one of the things that you were saying in the article that I read originally was that for many environmentalists it's a very hard thing for them to understand that consciousness is part of the solution, if you like, for our environmental problems. And I remember the film The Age of Stupid. There was a series of premieres, and I went to the one in Reading a couple of years ago when the film came out, and I really liked the way it was done with having all these different premieres, and there was a question and answer afterwards, and it was an interesting film. It was obviously set in the future with someone looking back and describing what had happened to what was going to happen to the planet unless we change. And really all the questions without fail were all about politicians doing things, and I thought, how sad, because it isn't just about politicians doing things, it's about all of us understanding what true sustainability is. And that's something that maybe you could talk about, what true sustainability is in terms of the environment and the future.
Well, yes, and I just, before going to that, I'll just come to this point about, because the where you started this question was about environmentalism and the relationship with spirituality or consciousness. And it now, obviously, Well, and also if I go back in my own story again to this time when I was exploring all these things, at the same time I'd become extremely interested in environmental issues. And so I'd read, for example, Schumacher's book Small is Beautiful when that came out, whenever that was, around about 1970. So that was a developing interest of mine in parallel with this spiritual thing. So for me, I'd been discovering the two sort of themes side by side. But what I've realized, of course, talking to many people about these things over the years, is that some people went through that kind of path, and other people seem to go on a path only of becoming aware of environmental issues. And in many cases, this produces quite a lot of fear, because if you accept the kind of, the 20th century or 19th century or whenever it is, view that we are, life is an accident, and that we're on this lonely rock, this planet in the middle of empty space, and there's nobody else out there, and this is some kind of freak accident that we have a biosphere, and here we are, busy tearing it to pieces, then of course that's tragic. That's, I'm not saying it isn't tragic, but it's particularly tragic and particularly alarming if you think that's all there is. Because if you have no perspective that there's anything other than what we see, and in the years since then we're beginning to find other planets which look a bit like ours, and so there's a chance that there are some out there. But basically there is this feeling that, as I think Professor Wilson at Harvard put it, and the quote I particularly like: "One planet, one experiment." We don't get a second go at this. We're going to do it right, or we'll destroy the whole planet, which is, of course, a serious risk. So, I think what. And I've sort of struggled with this tension quite a bit, because it's quite clear that we're doing very serious damage to the environment, and something has to be done about that. And that motivated a lot of my work in the late 1980s and the 90s around sustainability, to come to your other part of your question. And so I was taking that sort of, as it were, putting the spiritual bit to one side. Let's just focus on this question: what exactly is this problem that we have? And I was at that time, in the late 1980s, I was working at a technology consulting company in Boston, Arthur D. Little, and doing all sorts of projects like bits and pieces for the space station and this kind of thing. So I started, and the firm had an environmental division, a technology development division, and also a management consulting. And the environment division was growing very rapidly. I think there were about the increase, year-on-year increase in sales in the late 80s was about 40%. So all of the problems that were coming to roost as a result of the things done by, if you like, the technology side of the house, were, earning money on both sides. But I started saying, look, we should be doing something different. We should be designing the technology differently. If we take this environmental problem seriously, we can't just keep designing the technology in the same way as we have in the past, because look, it's clear what this is now doing. And everybody says, "Oh no, that's sort of science fiction. You can't ask questions like that. That's off in the distant past, if ever. But I decided that it was worth thinking about that, and out of that came. I didn't single-handedly invent it, but I think I contributed significantly to it, the early development of the field of industrial ecology. Because it seemed to me that the essence of the problem, from a technological perspective, was that we have an industrial economy on the planet which is processing materials. It's, we dig things up from the Earth's crust, we cut down trees and so on, we process these materials. They go through the kind of economic domain and earn money, and then we just throw away all the material residue. And the kind of numbers that I could find around that time were that every 1 kilogram, or every pound, if you like, of finished goods that you buy in the shops, 20 kilograms of waste have been created upstream, and within 6 months of purchase, on average, half of the kilogram is already waste. So there's a colossal level of waste. So that was one element. We are processing things in a way that causes all the residue to just go out into the environment, and the amount of stuff is increasing exponentially. That means it's not a steady increase like this. It's an exponential, a geometric increase. It's doubling with every period of time. So the amount of material that goes through the industrial economy doubles roughly every 20 years. So this is very rapid growth, and if you go back a couple of hundred years to the beginning of industrialization, the amount of industrial activity was really small compared to the planet, compared to the biosphere. But now, the scale of what we're doing is about the same as the biosphere. the tons of stuff that we're processing, is about the same as the flows of various elements in the biosphere itself. So we're actually at that point where we're about neck and neck with the biosphere. And if we have another doubling, we're going to completely overwhelm it. Yeah. So this analysis basically led to my proposing, ways of addressing this flow of materials by changing the technological design.
And how do you feel as a world we are responding to this now?
Well, I can't say an awful lot has been done. In fact, if I look back over the last 20-odd years, for most of that time, these were just ideas. Now, admittedly, they did get picked up. The industrial ecology itself became a whole academic field. First of all, it got a peer-reviewed journal published out of the Yale School of Forestry in the early 1990s. And there's a lot of academic work that's been done since then, analysing these flows of materials and looking for alternative pathways, green chemistry alternatives. So there's a great deal of, if you like, sort of foundational research work has been going on. But it's really only, I would say, in about the last 5 years, so talking about the United States, that industry in general has begun to catch up with these ideas and has begun seriously addressing how it actually changes its technological design, or its sort of technological architecture, if you like, the architecture of production, to actually accommodate these or to pick up these ideas. So I do think it's finally beginning to happen, but there was an awful long period when nothing happened. It's sometimes like you get these functions where nothing seems to be happening, and suddenly, something, there's been a gradual build-up, a kind of gestation of an idea, and then suddenly it reaches critical mass.
Why do you think it is? It's like the analogy comes to mind of the frog in the boiling water. If you put the frog in boiling water, he jumps out. If you slowly boil the water, he gets boiled, well, basically.
This is a tricky one because obviously the analogy is interesting, but as far as I can ascertain, and somebody actually asked me to look into this, it's completely the opposite. That in actual fact, if you slowly heat up a frog, it does notice and it does jump out.
Really?
And if you throw it in boiling water, it dies immediately. So
anyway,
but leaving that aside, I mean, this notion that somehow, this is creeping up on us and we don't react. And I think there is something in that. But what, in a sense, is more alarming is that, we tend to not notice problems until they're really significant. But because we're dealing with exponential growth, that's to say, in the next period of time, let's say we've got a problem and the problem is sort of halfway done. But because in the next period of time it's going to double, then it goes from half full problem to complete problem in a fraction of the time it took it to get to the halfway mark. So psychologically, that's really problematic. Because by the time we get that something needs to be done, there's almost no time left.
But why are we so slow to get it as a human race and as individuals?
Well, I think there we get into now areas of psychology and sociology and so on. Why don't we adapt? Why do we? Why? I mean, there are all sorts of reasons for this. I mean, perhaps a two-word, overly slick response would be to say cognitive inertia. We're just not that good at picking up. Not so much picking up new ideas. We don't mind ideas that are relatively small in the context of things that we can implement, but it's much more difficult to just change the entire game, just to stop. Imagine sort of playing a game of football or something and you just blow the whistle, stop the game, okay, we're going to rewrite the rules completely and then start again. That's not something people generally want to do. They like going on playing the existing game.
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously you have, I would call it a spiritual context for looking at life, and I think increasingly people have that. They see more of a bigger picture of how everything fits or may fit together. And it does seem that we're essentially driven by all the time trying to move towards pleasure and away from pain. That's I know it's a simplistic way of looking at human psychology, but that's...
We discount the longer term in favour of the shorter term.
Exactly,
and
it's very much... a good example is our governments, basically. They're re-elected in 4 or 5 years' time, and after about sort of 2 or 3 years, it's down to can they get re-elected, trying to do the right things, and no one's really having the bigger picture.
Those time frames are so short compared to maybe not now, maybe we're right down to the wire now, but before the political time frames were much shorter than these kind of problem time frames, so it could always be left to the future. And also, people generally, if it comes to an overall change like that, they wait until everybody else agrees that there's a problem. Nobody really likes to sort of stick their neck out, so everybody's waiting for everybody else to actually say, yes, this is serious, we should do something about it.
So these days, as a futurist, what do you suggest to people in terms of when you work for companies?
I mean, I quite often give presentations around this kind of thing, and those presentations tend to have sort of two themes. One is that there's a technical set of solutions which are broadly along the lines that I've just been describing. In other words, we can close the materials loops, we can change the way we manufacture things in order to reduce this flow of waste. That's technically feasible. It doesn't require new technology in the sense of fundamental breakthroughs. What it really requires is redesign of existing know-how. If we get new technology, if we get, say, nanotechnology abilities, then that's good, because it helps us go in that direction. But it's not essential. It's really a change of the way we use technology, not a change in the fundamentals of technology itself. And then that also needs to be side by side with some kind of change of mind, if you like. And all the studies that have been done, going right back to the limits to growth in the 1970s, showed that in order to achieve sustainability, you have to not only change the technology, but also change social values or social behaviors. If you just did one or the other, you still got the collapse. This limits to growth study was a big computer model of the whole world economy, and it was done in the 1970s by people at MIT. And it showed that there would be, if nothing changed, there would be a general system collapse early in the 21st century. And in fact, if you look at those graphs, it's sort of around about 2015, 2020 when this collapse begins to occur. And of course, this was roundly, dismissed at the time. People said that's rubbish. And by the 1980s, people said, look, it hasn't happened, overlooking the fact that the model itself didn't say it was going to happen yet. But anyway, in that model study, they also experimented to see what they would have to change to make this collapse not happen. And they found that if you change technology, which would correspond to what I was describing, you simply delayed the collapse. And if you change social values without changing technology, also you simply delayed the collapse. But it was only when you did both at once that the situation stabilized. So therefore, the sort of other half of my message and also my research has been to ask the question, well, is there any chance that we will change? We will have a change of mind in time to deploy the technology, because we've got the technology there in principle, but are we going to change? So I've become very interested in the work around cultural values change. So there's the whole phenomenon of the so-called cultural creative shift in value that Paul Ray has been researching.
So when you say, to get back to basics, when you say cultural values, what do you mean by that?
Well, a shift, basically what seems to be going on is a shift in the fundamental cultural beliefs and values from the ideas of modernity, the sort of rather materialistic ideas that, this is all we see around us is all there is, and, it's a physical universe and so on, to a position which is much more aligned around these concerns about the environment, concerns about social justice. There are a social element to it, also personal development, both psychological and spiritual, and it seems to be a whole bundle of new beliefs, a completely new way of looking at the world. But as a futurist, of course, I was interested not simply in the idea that it's reported that this change is going on, but in how quickly it's going on and when it might get to the point where it would seriously change things, because that's sort of interesting question. So the Paul Ray's data, the cultural creative data, is not the only data that looks at this. There are other lines of survey. There's the World Value Survey, which is more or less looking at the same thing, and that's covered 70 countries over a long period of time, over the last 30 years, and it shows the same move towards a new set of values. So I just recently applied a forecasting technique to the numbers that Paul Ray has produced, and the most recent surveys of his was done by the TNS survey company in 2008, and they basically, when you apply the forecasting technique to that, and you look at how the numbers are gradually rising, as the numbers rise, of course, it means that the old value set, the old way of thinking, is gradually coming down, because this is a finite 100% of the population, and if you're gradually getting an increase in one set, the other is coming down. And the interesting point is, where do they meet? Because at the point where these two curves cross over, the new value set is suddenly the dominant one. and the old value set of modernity has crossed over and has become the diminishing one. But this happens immediately at the crossover point. Well, or around that crossover
Yes, and
point.
it seems that this is more quantum because we've got obviously the political things going on, the Arab Spring. This week we're engrossed in the whole thing with the Murdoch Empire and his newspapers and their maybe rather unsavoury practices. So it does seem that things can collapse quite fast now.
Well, things could change very fast if the underlying belief system has suddenly, the dominant underlying belief system has just been swapped for another one. Then things could change extremely rapidly. And just to finish the previous line of thought, when I ran the forecasting approach, it showed that the crossover was actually just about now, 2011 or approximately. I mean, there's a little, it's not absolutely precise, but it would be around now, not in 10 years, not 10 years ago, but just about now. So that is very interesting in terms of the potential now for quite rapid change in this direction.
So the old starts to crumble and the new has energetically in a balanced way has more impetus behind it.
Yeah.
And so what's some examples of the new emerging, would you say?
Well, of course, I think one of the prime examples, is what Paul Hawken has written about in his book. It's.
I'm not aware of this, so you need to explain this.
He basically started getting interested a few years ago. He started getting interested in the number of NGOs that existed in the world, and discovered that that was rising exponentially. And in fact, if you go back to sort of 100 years or so, there are just a handful of NGOs in the whole world. And now there are, hundreds of thousands. And he has a presentation where he shows, he starts scrolling the names of these and the list just gets longer and longer and the camera zooms out. And it's just an enormous number of small grassroots organizations all around the planet that are acting on behalf of, environmental issues, social justice issues, awareness raising and consciousness raising issues. There's a ferment of grassroots change which is invisible as far as the dominant media are concerned, or the dominant mindset, but is I would say strong evidence for this underlying sort of ferment of change, which is up to now everybody. Well, one of the characteristics of this new value sort of orientation is that people tend to think it's just themselves. So as I was describing my sort of journey towards a more spiritual perspective, I could have easily just thought, well, it's just me, I'm just doing crazy stuff, probably nobody else is interested in this. And certainly that was the impression I got reflected back to me in the 1970s. But actually that's no longer true. It's now to the point where almost 50% of the population in developed countries, even if they might not be saying so, have actually shifted to this new way of thinking.
It's interesting. We had an interview earlier today with Richard Barrett, who's if it might be a futurist leader consultant, I suppose, and he very much talked about the I becoming we in terms of business. And used to be in businesses, it was always I, and we had to be successful, and we were a closed shop, us against the world. And now it's changing, and it's very much businesses that cooperate and see it as a we as the way forward and not the I. And it seems that you're pretty much saying the same thing.
Those themes moving away from competition towards cooperation is part of this overall shift.
Yes.
But of course this means that all the institutions and organisational forms that we've had in the past, which were suited to this rapid growth period that we've been going through for sort of 200 years, are all going to have to change. And the analogy that is often given is this idea of what happens inside the chrysalis, when a butterfly is forming. The caterpillar creates the chrysalis and is completely enclosed by the chrysalis and turns into a butterfly. But what actually happens to all the cellular structure of the caterpillar is it just melts away. It turns into a kind of undifferentiated goo, and out of that forms the new structure of the butterfly. Yeah. So it seems to me, I find a very, very telling metaphor, because it seems like wherever you look, all the old structures that we've been used to are kind of falling apart. You give the example of the newspaper industry or whatever it is. Everything just seems to be coming apart at the seams. But that could be exactly what we need in order to have a completely fresh start.
Yes.
So this is a bit like my example of the football game, which is going to stop and restart with a completely new set of rules.
Yeah. It's interesting from the psychological point of view, because you feel that the obvious corruption and the bad things, quote, bad things in the world are being found out, and through the power of the people, especially in the Arab Spring, things are falling down. And yet, with the Arab Spring, the new is having a few teething problems, shall we say? And it's but as you say, it probably is. The butterfly is forming there, but it hasn't quite flourished yet. It
The
hasn't
wings
quite
are still a bit
itself.
rumpled. They're unfolding.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So I know this isn't really your thing to give suggestions as such, but I'm interested, as people watching this, in their own lives, is the things that people can start to look at either inside or on the outside practically, of how they can, if they feel a connection with what you're saying, they can help this all move forward.
Well, of course, there are probably dozens of things that one could say. I think one, as you ask the question, what comes to me as being particularly important is for people to regain confidence in their own personal experience. And I really, of course, thinking of interior, personal experience, because again, if I was born in the middle of the 20th century and was exposed to, modernity at its height, and was taught that, it's only an objective physical world and so on, and various categories of professional person, doctors, psychologists, whoever, basically had, by the middle of the 20th century, managed to persuade people that any internal subjective experience was basically not significant. So, that old thing, if you hear voices in your head, it's the first sign of madness. I remember my mother telling me that. So as a result, we don't trust subjective experience. We like to see that's written down in a book, or somebody else validates it, or whatever. But if we can allow ourselves to trust our own subjective experience and to follow where that might lead us, then I think that is a really important key to opening the door to this, library I was talking about.
Yeah, I was just looking at my notes here, and from the interview that you did with the magazine, which is called Enlighten Next, actually, in case somebody wants to look up the internet. You're saying we need extra qualities of intuition, empathy, feeling for nature, and sensitivity to spirit. I think that's put very well there. There's many different levels, isn't there, to this?
I mean, obviously, there's another thing, this is quite at random, being or trying to maintain an optimistic outlook rather than a pessimistic outlook. Now, from my kind of professional futures research stance, we don't know, what is said is the truisms of this profession. Now, none of us know for sure what's going to happen. And that means that you can't prove the case for either optimism or pessimism in advance. We may have lots of fears, but we also have hopes, but you can't actually prove the case in advance. But if you're optimistic, you're much more likely to take actions that are going to lead to a good outcome, because you believe that this might be possible. If you're pessimistic, you think, well, the game's over, there's no point trying. So I think that from a personal point of view, to try and find hope and to follow that the little glimmer of hope is really important. And that's why in my kind of non-professional work, writing up, for example, I should mention that I've written up this forecast I did with the cultural creative data. That's in the current issue of the Journal of Future Studies. You can find that on the web. My efforts to do that kind of thing are deliberately an effort to construct an optimistic case. I can't prove it, but I do believe it's really important that a well-argued, credible, optimistic future sort of outcome can actually be seen, can be portrayed.
Do you feel that big corporations are receptive?
Well, there is change going on, and if you think about this idea that by now we're just at this sort of 50% mark in a change of cultural values, but that these people are still somewhat in the closet, let's say, what it means is that even in corporations, that half of the people in the corporation actually have a value set which is probably at variance with the kind of official story about what a corporation is supposed to be about. So if not quite yet, very soon now, there will be a demand within these organizations that they change in these ways as well. So possibly they're lagging, but I think or again from the the survey data, one of the interesting things that Paul Ray discovered was that there was a group of people who were on the cusp, as it were, between these two value sets. They were still holding on to the modern way of thinking, the modernist way of thinking, because they wanted it to be proved that it was viable to move into this new world. But as soon as they would see that it was really credible in practical terms, they could kind of make a living and this kind of thing in this new world, then they would kind of make the shift. And so I think I look around and I see an extraordinary number of social enterprises people are starting, and real enthusiasm to do things in a different way. And I think that is where you see the beginnings of this sort of seeds of a completely new way of doing things.
So small is the new big in one way, is possibly.
Well, this small might be tomorrow's big, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because my basic business is the record business, how I earn my money, and it's just extraordinary what's happened the last year in the record business, especially in the UK. The number of independent artists, that's artists that are generally signed to independently own record labels as opposed to signed to multinational corporations. They've become so much more successful, and the market share for independents has gone up 50% this year, from something like 20 to 30%, which is very significant. And it's something, it's self-perpetuating, self-supporting, because artists want to be successful, so they look to who's being successful, so they're drawn now to independent companies, whereas before they were drawn to bigger companies. And I think that's probably, and I'm also thinking of something that my wife and I are quite supportive of, is Ecology, which is a small company based in Stroud who build their own windmills and provide electricity, and they've just had a bond issue which we've supported. And it's like, yes, we can all go out and support these smaller companies that actually are coming from a relatively new set of values.
Yeah, definitely. Ecotricity is interesting because its business model is one as a transitional business model. So they decided that rather than selling purely green electricity from the outset, they would sell brown electricity across the grid that they would buy in the way an ordinary company would, but they would use all the proceeds to invest in a bigger and bigger fleet of renewable power sources or windmills. So that seems to me the sort of thing one might be looking for, the means of getting from the old to the new, ingenious business models of that kind that make the transition.
And the guy Dale Vince, the guy that started it, he came from a very much alternative background. He wasn't a classic businessman, and he's built something. And it just like that. For me, that's always an example of someone that doesn't necessarily have the obvious things stacked in his favour, build something that's of significance.
Well, I think this is the moment, because again, if the big companies don't take these opportunities, if they're unable to see them, then there's a huge field of opportunities created in the whole area of sustainable business, sustainable technology, and so on.
So we've got about 3-4 minutes left. How would you like to use the last 3 or 4 minutes if I put my notes aside and give you an open space?
Well, I mean, just there was another thought that I will say. I don't know if it's relevant for 3 minutes, but last 3 minutes. But you were talking about the independent record producers and so on, and referred to the newspaper industry earlier on. But of course, what we haven't touched on is the whole dynamics of the internet and the way information technology is changing the way society communicates. So the mass media and the mass broadcasters and newspapers and so on were the dominant cultural form of communication in the past, but clearly the way the internet works is many to many. It's not this kind of mass one-way communication, and I think we're now just about beginning to get the hang of how to work that. How to actually get record companies or let's say musicians who can actually earn a living in that kind of environment, since the old ones sort of fallen over, And so one of the additional things that makes me optimistic is that this value shift has the accelerator behind it of all of the new internet modes of interaction and communication. So that acts as a kind of amplifying factor once it comes into force.
Yeah.
That was the thought off the top of my head.
Okay, and it's very much, I think the theme of our interview has very much been the kind of different sides moving together, the inner side, the progression, the deepening of the understanding of oneself and the widening of the perspective of what we really are, together with the practicalities of the environment and the serious situation that we're in fact, on a practical level. We're in a very serious situation, but as you say, there's hope.
And I do think that all of these things are converging to produce a kind of transformation, a cultural, a planetary transformation, because we cannot keep going. This existing situation cannot keep going. It's like the proverbial bicycle. Or perhaps not like the proverbial bicycle. It has if it carries on exactly as it is, it's got the seeds of its own destruction within it. And so something new must emerge from this. And I believe it has to emerge really quite soon now, because we can't carry on like this for a whole lot longer. And in a sense, I've been waiting for this moment for a very long time now, maybe for sort of 30 or 40 years, or even longer, feeling that something like this was coming up in my lifetime. But there were moments during that time when I sort of thought, well, my God, this is taking so long. Am I right? Maybe nothing's happening. But I really do feel that there is a tide turning now. And, we really are moving, potentially, there's still risk, but potentially moving into a new world.
So, as always, but extra special now is the time.
Yeah. Yes.
Hardin, thank you very much for coming along and chatting. It's been really interesting.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for watching Hardin Tibbs on Conscious TV. And I hope we see you again soon. Goodbye.